Welcome to this special Halloween edition of Hence the Future podcast. I'm Mattimore Cronin,
I'm Claire Cronin.
and today we're discussing horror, ghosts, and God. Claire, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Matt. I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. So, for our listeners, in case you couldn't tell by our last names, Claire is my sister, and she is also the author of Blue Light of the Screen on Horror, Ghosts, and God. It's a book about superstition, delusion, the things that keep us up at night, and it's currently available for pre-order. It comes out on October 16th, just in time for Halloween.
October
Uh,
13th.
oh, 13th.
Even sooner, even more unlucky of a date.
Perfect, perfect. And Claire is also a musician, a poet, a PhD, an artist. And what I love about your book, Claire, is that it describes the indescribable. And I read a lot of nonfiction, so I spend a lot of time hearing about the world of science, and people hardly ever talk about what's really going on in people's minds and what's going on perhaps in other dimensions or memories and ghosts and what this means in the modern context, how that's changed from the ancient context. And you really have a multi-sensory experience when you're reading the book. It's not just prose or academic analysis. It also has poetry. It also has drawings in it. So I was just absolutely blown away by it. And, you know, I'll be the first to admit that in the first few pages of reading the book, I was brought to tears
Oh,
because that's how powerful it was.
thank
So
you.
I really highly recommend this book. And I want to talk about the three main topics in your book: horror, ghosts, and God, in that order. And
hmm
then I also want to talk a little bit about the blue light of the screen part of it, which is our digital reality and how that may evolve in the future. So let's start with horror. I want to first ask you, why do people watch horror movies? What do they get out of horror movies? And why are some people really drawn to them and they really enjoy horror movies, as paradoxical as that sounds, whereas
hmm
other people can't stand a single second of it and they're hiding with their hands over their eyes?
I mean, I think there are a lot of reasons for it, and any theory that I've read that claims to answer that question in an absolute way, I feel like I've always found holes in it or exceptions. Um, but in general, it seems that, some people do get pleasure out of watching horror movies. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they, and by them, I mean like we, myself, um, want to see like real life horrific things happen.
Hmm.
So there's some kind of like aesthetic distance because it's fictional, because it's usually has like all of these stylistic effects, um, where it's far enough away from you and unreal enough that it can become entertaining, but it contains elements about like death, illness, violence, that I would suspect. I mean, maybe most people are thinking about already, just like
Hmm.
living in the world, but perhaps horror fans, like it's more at kind of like the top of their minds.
Right.
Um, so for me, I think as someone who feels a lot of anxiety in general, and like, especially this year, but just, since childhood, I've liked horror and I've dealt with a lot of anxiety and depression and have had kind of a pessimistic view of the world. Like there's something about seeing horror movies that's like both kind of satisfying because it's like, oh, here are all these things haunting my mind and now they're put out there on a screen and I can watch them, and like conquer them in a way, at least temporarily.
Yeah, it's almost like you're preparing yourself for the worst possible thing that could happen.
Yeah, but it's also comforting because it's like it's unlikely that it'll actually be that bad. And so compared to your
Right.
daily worries, it's sort of like
It puts your own problems in
distracting.
perspective a
Yeah.
little bit. Yeah. It's also interesting to think evolutionarily how, children being afraid of monsters in the dark, for instance, that's a real evolutionary adaptation where if you're a child who's not afraid of monsters in the dark, you probably would have been eaten by some predator on the savannah thousands of years ago. So
Yeah.
everyone alive today has that innate fear of monsters in the dark to some degree, or we wouldn't
Yeah,
be
and
here.
I think there's a benefit to being vigilant and frightened. And also there's something about watching horror that to me felt like I was cultivating some kind of bravery. I don't know how. I don't know how useful that bravery is when put in a real world context. Um, but just like being able to watch things that are scary and kind of face like these worst case scenarios. Uh, I don't know. Yeah, it feels more psychologically useful to me than this destructive thing, like you're filling your mind with bad images.
Right. It's more like the Roman take of memento mori, like being mindful of death.
Definitely. Yeah.
And I love like Alan Watts talks a lot about fear of death, and he talks specifically about what he calls the screamy memes, which is
Hmm.
like the worst possible thing you could ever experience in your life. Like just think about the most painful possible death, like agony, like just the worst possible thing, and
Hmm.
everyone is afraid of that. And you can either push it aside and not deal with it, or you can kind of deal with it head on before you have to actually deal with it. And in that sense, maybe you'll be able to live your life more fully.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. I mean, what do you think about like we watched a lot of horror movies growing up?
Right. Well, that's what I was going to say is that you and I both really enjoyed horror a lot growing up, but it does seem like, and you talk about this in your book, at a certain point, you could handle horror movies that Ryan and Johanna and I couldn't. And so it's interesting to think about why people have different thresholds for a certain type of horror. And like I'm at the point in my life now where I pretty much never watch horror unless
Hmm.
it's something that I feel like has a real like message or meaning behind it that's more artistic and it's not
Sure.
just about the scare factor. So
Yeah.
like The Witch, Midsummer, Train
Right.
to Busan, like I love those kind of movies now. But I used to love just like, slash 'em up
Yeah,
zombie
yeah.
killer movies and I like never watch those anymore.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like my tastes have become more discerning since I started writing the book just from having watched so much. And there are still, I mean, I'm not like completely numb. Like there are certain things I won't watch and will turn the movie off. Like I really hate amputation
Mm.
and I can't tolerate much sexual violence.
Yeah, I'm the same way. Yeah, I like more when it's like a mystery or there's something indescribable that,
Yeah,
and I actually this might be a good time to bring up some of the taglines in popular horror movies that you mentioned in your book
sure.
because this can get at the notion of what makes something scary. So
Hmm.
imagine your worst fear a reality. There are some frequencies we were never meant to find. We tell ourselves there's nothing to fear, but sometimes we're wrong. Not every gift is a blessing. Sooner or later, they will find you. It's not the house that's haunted. Some things cannot be explained. And my favorite one, they're here.
Yeah.
But I love the they're here one because it's like you can almost imagine if you're living some peaceful hunter gatherer life and then all of a sudden like the lookout guy comes and he's like they're here and it's like in that moment you have that fight or flight like you realize you're going to have to fight for your life, possibly die, possibly
Hmm.
experience agonizing pain, but also you can't let that immobilize you. You have to jump into action right then.
Right. Yeah, these are definitely really ancient fears, even if they are put into movies where it's like the ghost is haunting you through a cell phone. Like it's,
Hmm.
the return of the dead, the threat of violence against your family. But I think like some of those do point to another pleasure of horror or of the kind of horror I like, which is more the supernatural,
Hmm.
mysterious stuff, which is like an intellectual pleasure of watching a mystery be solved and like the
Right.
investigative scenes. So in that way, it's similar to kind of like a detective story. Um,
Like the skeleton key I was thinking about where it's basically, this old sort of, Bayou Cajun voodoo kind of or hoodoo, I guess, kind of culture
mhm,
and this very modern white woman comes in and is caring for this elderly man and then
right.
by the end you find out the man is trapped in his own body and
Yeah.
he's really a young person whose young body was taken by someone else
Yeah.
and so it's yeah I love movies like that because it makes you really realize like the fear of being trapped, but also the fear of like of losing your youth, or the fear of someone
Hmm.
taking something from you that you could never get back. And
Yeah,
the other thing I love about that movie is that it only works because she believes in it. And they
right.
say at the end, you know, people who are familiar with hoodoo don't even last a day because they see that it's something they shouldn't mess with, and they leave immediately. It was only a modern woman who was able
Right.
to actually like get basically, you know, tricked into believing all this stuff, and then
Right.
it became
Yeah.
real.
Yeah. I mean, I think I feel like I've read a little bit on some internet forums about what real hoodoo practitioners think of that movie. And I think that the idea that it only works if you believe in it is like a is a more contemporary secular notion that totally makes sense to us and would make sense to the main audience for the film. But of course, the people that are like practicing root work are like, no, it works either way.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, you also mentioned that the popular modern theory is that, quote, evil is drawn to any negativity, negative thoughts, negative emotions, negative actions, negative media of any kind. So I'm curious if you think that that theory is more right than wrong, if you think that there is something about, you know, you are your thoughts, and putting negative thoughts in your head kind of pulls you towards that negative reality.
I
Or
mean,
if, yeah.
yeah, I don't think that's the I don't think that's the contemporary secular theory, but I think that comes from like kind of Catholic and Christian sort of panics about horror and supernatural evil. But yeah, it's also reflected in like like semi new age positive psychology stuff that is very mainstream. Um, but no, I don't believe that my thoughts control the world, and thinking a negative thought brings something negative on me unless that influences my actions. But I think that's a dangerous road to go down, like especially in sort of new age culture where you start blaming people for getting cancer or
Hmm.
something because they like were holding a grudge against somebody.
Right.
Um, but I do think I'm not dismissing that idea either. I think the warnings that I've received from growing up in a religious household and having like our mom be sort of suspicious of all of that stuff and keep telling me that it's wrong to be watching horror movies, that sticks in the back of my mind. Like
Hmm.
I do, I do worry over that in the book,
Right.
but I don't know what other people believe in America right now about what evil is. Like, we're not in a fully secular culture. Like, it's a very kind of religious and extreme culture in some places. And so I think some people definitely believe in the devil, and for some people, they thought that died out in like the medieval times.
Right. With Nietzsche's God is dead.
Sure, or like before then.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, I'm interested in thinking about what evil is because there are just some human actions that seem beyond explanation with what we know about psychology or biology or some defect in your brain.
Right. Well, there is the very real phenomena of sadism and masochism, where you get pleasure in either bringing pain upon someone else or bringing pain upon yourself. And that seems like a demonic spirit. And I mean, if you could think of that in the literal sense of like, you know, a Christian, like a literal spirit, or you could just think of it as something about our nature that
Yeah.
is inherently evil, and maybe it's almost like it's passed down through our DNA through the generations,
Yeah.
and some people have it, so it does kind of pop up at certain times, whether it's the right sort of like a really difficult environment, or it's just the person that has the right physiology or like the right circumstances, like all of a sudden someone threatens you and then this like demonic rage comes over you.
Yeah. Watched that true crime documentary that's on Netflix, which I'm forgetting the name of. It's like this guy kills his wife and kids, but it's really scary because the whole thing is just shown through social media videos and then interrogation videos. There's like no dramatization. Um, but it just seems like he was a completely normal guy and then he snapped. And I've been reading a lot of true crime stuff for work. Um, and I can't resolve the question. Like it does seem like, okay, I guess humans are inherently very violent animals, and
Hmm.
some more than others. And there does seem to be something that can be triggered, and it can turn you into like a very evil killer, or maybe like that same impulse could make you act heroically on a battlefield or something more useful.
Right. Yeah, and I think a lot of it just comes down to you can think of things in a very literal sense, like how it's manifested in the world. Like you have a heroic person, or a villainous person, or a true friend, or a lover. Or you can have the abstract concept of what heroism is in the abstract, or what being a villain is in the abstract. And I don't think you could say that the abstract notion of it that's common across many different beings living in many different places in time and space is any less real than the instances of it appearing in this person or that person. So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean that's part of what I love about your books, because there's so few books that even try to describe what's going on in that realm, and your
Thanks.
book does a really great job of it. So maybe we can talk now a little bit about ghosts, and specifically, I'm curious to hear your take on the what's different about the modern interpretation of ghosts, which you use the ghost whisperer as one example, versus
Mhm.
the more ancient interpretation of ghosts and what they mean.
I mean, I think there are different kinds of ghost stories, and the idea of ghosts and ghost stories, either like true legends or fictional things, are some of the oldest stories that we have in human culture. But the sort of ghost whisperer, which is this TV show with Jennifer Love Hewitt that I used to love watching while I was cooking, um, is like a melodramatic ghost story. So there's like a heavenly afterlife, but the show is not Christian. Like they don't talk about religion, and she helps the ghost to move on and acts as like almost like a therapist to them. But she's really just like a very loving psychic medium. And I mean, there's some kind of evil force, but it's not exactly hell. Uh, and the traumas that the ghost went through that made them stuck on Earth are like usually pretty minor misunderstandings that they
Hmm.
had with like a relative or something. Um, and so it's melodramatic in the sense of it's clear who the good guys are and the bad guys are, and the plot follows a kind of like something scary or tragic happens, and then in the end it's resolved in a kind of bittersweet way. Like it's sad that the ghost is still dead, or the ghost gives its final message to a loved one, but then they get to move on.
Hmm.
So I think there are a lot of ghost stories like that in popular horror movies, like um,
The Sixth
and
Sense I was thinking of is kind of like that.
yeah, The Sixth Sense, the Conjuring series, even though it's like they have to leave something awful to keep creating a sequel.
Hmm.
Insidious, like a lot of the ones that are kind of about families, have this melodramatic and like almost Christian kind of like you can be redeemed at the end message.
Right.
But then there are still ghost stories that are just they end I mean you see a lot of it in like the Japanese horror and the remakes of those films, like The Ring and The Grudge, where it's like the ghost is just this almost like virus that just wants to keep killing people, and it almost doesn't matter what trauma happened to them because all they are is like full of rage.
Right. Yeah, that seems to be more like the sort of just like the Hollywood pure entertainment aspect of it, where it's just like you have these hordes of demons that aren't anything like real humans, and
Yeah,
you've got the hero that doesn't even have to feel bad about vanquishing them because
right.
they're just pure evil embodied. Whereas you have other stories that seem more like in line with what it really means to live a life, and where if
Yeah.
you can't find peace at the end of your life, you're not ready to go to that next stage, whether it's heaven or reincarnation or eternal silence or whatever it is. Um, and yeah, so I'm also curious, you make this distinction between ghosts and demons, and how ghosts aren't often able to, traditionally actually speak to people, whereas demons sometimes are able to speak and trick you. So um,
Yeah.
I'm curious to hear your like take on the difference between ghosts and demons.
I mean, this comes from a Catholic context. I'm not sure if there are similar ideas in other traditions, but um, if we're talking about ghosts and Catholicism, which is like something that a lot of theologians just haven't talked about at all, but based on the ones that have, like, a ghost can only appear to you if God is giving it permission to do it. And the only reason God would give it permission is so the ghost can kind of ask for prayers or resolve something. But I mean, according to what I've read and heard, the ghosts don't talk. They just kind of appear as these images, and maybe they're weeping or they're gesturing in some way. Whereas a demon, according to this, a demon can say all kinds of things, or it could
Mm,
take on the appearance of like a ghost of a loved one that you are really grieving. And so the Catholic criticism of things like, holding a seance or using a Ouija board is like those are just demons. Like you are only you are only
right.
talking with demons who are pretending to be ghosts. And I don't know if that's, I mean, I think it's probably more mysterious than that with like when I think about what I actually believe. But it's a really interesting idea to me that like a mortal soul would be limited and not even able to speak when they reappear to the living, whereas like a demon would have kind of free reign and could be noisy and disruptive.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting too, and I think it's also you need not take it literally. Like it does seem like when you have some dark urge within you, you justify it to yourself and you kind of can convince yourself that even if you're doing an evil deed, it's somehow justified. And it's almost like, I imagine in Lord of the Rings where the king has that evil guy who's always whispering in his ear
Hmm.
and telling him what to do, like, this guy's trying to take you down, you've got to strike first, and all that kind of stuff. That's kind of the way demons, whether they're literal or
Right.
metaphorical, that's how they operate. Whereas
Yeah.
with ghosts, it's more like maybe you have some sadness tugging at you,
Yeah.
or you have some guilt, or there's something unfinished. And it's not like you really are explicitly know what to do, but you can just kind of feel that you need to give some compassion in
Yeah.
order to be at peace. Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about.
That makes sense to me. And yeah, I think the mood of a ghost or of a haunting is like sadness
Hmm.
and maybe dread and fear around it. But yeah, it seems like images flashing in your mind of that person or of something like that. And then, yeah,
Yeah.
as you say, just like a mood kind of infecting you.
Well, I want to bring up one example of dread with the experience of a ghost and one of
Mm.
sadness.
Hmm.
So there's this one ghost story that has been passed down in our family that you mentioned about a disembodied growl that one
Oh,
of our
yeah.
relatives heard. Maybe you could just tell that story briefly.
I mean, that was a friend of mom and dad's who heard it. Um, who I don't know that much about, but he, I guess he heard just a growl in the air, like a demonic growl, and it frightened him so much that he converted back to Catholicism after leaving it.
Yeah, that is like just so terrifying. I mean, it's amazing when you look at something like that and it literally changed this guy's whole life. And whether that literally happened or it was in his
Mhm.
mind, either way, it's powerful.
Right, yeah.
Um, so I thought that was really interesting. And then as far as a sad example of a ghost sighting, you have memory as almost a kind of ghost,
Definitely.
and so you talk about our grandfather. I'll quote it from the book. At the nursing home before he died, my grandfather mistook drifts of snow outside his window for lost children. The orphans, my mother said he called them. Do you see them? It looks cold out there. Why doesn't someone do something?
Yeah.
So that is, I mean, it makes me think about how when you're in your twilight years, the memories that appear in your mind start to mesh with what you're actually experiencing in your sensory perceptions.
Hmm.
And I told this to Maria, my wife, and she said her grandma, who has Alzheimer's, has the same exact experience, except
Oh,
with
wow.
her, it's that she sees children in the reflections of all the glass windows at their house
Wow.
because they live up by a lake and like pretty much the whole wall is glass windows. And she's always saying like, "Oh, why don't they come inside?" Like, and the grandpa's like, "What are you talking about?" And
Wow. Yeah, that's really eerie.
but it does kind of feel like when you're in your twilight years and you're close to death, that it starts to, you start to experience, like it's like you've got one foot in this world and one foot in the other.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what people say. Yeah, it would make sense.
Yeah. Well, maybe we should get to our third topic, which is God. So I love talking and thinking about religion, and I find that anytime I talk to someone about religion, usually much of the misunderstanding can be corrected if we set a firm definition of God.
Hmm.
Because,
That sounds like the hardest possible thing to do.
right. But I guess for me, it's like when someone asks me, "Do you believe in God?" It depends on what their definition is. If they give one definition, I'll say yes, 100%. Whereas if they give another definition, I'll say no, 100%.
Yeah.
So how do you think about God? How would you define God? And how would you present your own beliefs?
I mean, I think I don't think there's been a time in my life when I have not been talking to God every day in prayer or in frustration, even in times when I was like more of a kind of atheist, nihilist. Like it never went away, like the longing for that. So I think for whatever reason, my mind is just kind of religiously skewed. But I think God is far more mysterious and unknowable than what I've learned within Catholicism or what I've learned in like studying other religious traditions, just sort of not extensively, but as an outsider. Um,
Is
I
there
think,
one religious system that you think gets to the closest, or
well, just because from such an early age, we grew up Catholic, like that resonates with me still. And for whatever things I disagree with and the history of Catholicism as this powerful and often like treacherous institution, there's something that feels really real there, in the supernatural aspects. And I don't know how it all works with like other people's beliefs. Um, but I think there's something going on, and sometimes it feels that something is responsive to my prayers and my rituals.
yeah, yeah. I would say that, I definitely consider myself to be a Christian as well. And I mean that more in the sense of I follow the example of Christ rather than all the doctrines and dogma
Yeah,
of
yeah,
all the ecumenical councils that decided what was going to be in the Bible or not in the
right.
Bible. Um, Although I would say that I think there's a little bit of a limitation with the metaphor of God as the king and the kingdom of
Definitely.
heaven and the monarchical view of religion. But it makes sense because that's what Jesus knew at the time, and that's what everyone he was talking to knew. So it was a really apt metaphor that anyone could easily understand, like God the Father. Um,
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm more interested. I still use that language because it's been passed down. I use it sometimes, but yeah, I think that's just coming from human culture and history, and I get more out of reading about mystical traditions, which are like more creative and visionary, and people are having like firsthand experiences.
yeah, and that's what I think Hinduism is the real value they bring is in realizing that we are all part of God. And one of the big mistranslations that Alan Watts points out is that Jesus actually said, "I am a son of God." He didn't say, "I am the son of God."
Hmm.
So it was almost like Christianity put him on this pedestal that no other human could get to. Is he's the son of God? Like, too bad you're not the son of God. He is.
Right.
Whereas in Hinduism, it's like we are all children of God and we are all the Godhead And when you sum up all of us together, that's what the Godhead is. It's not some external figure that's viewing us from afar. It's really like the summation of all of our conscious power, spiritual power, whatever you want to call it.
Except I would want it to go beyond just humans too, you know?
Yeah, yeah, totally, totally. It's not all just humans. I would say, I mean, this is a question I've had, and I don't know the answer, but I've always wondered if God is really truly cosmic in the sense that it's beyond Earth, beyond Earthlings, or if when we say God, what we really mean is Gaia, like Mother Earth.
Hmm.
And that's really like the grand psychic power that we're tapping into is the power of planet Earth.
I mean, it could be both, I think.
Hmm.
If it's just Gaia, then we are really in trouble.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, it's coming for us.
Well, what's your take on I wasn't planning to ask you this, but what's your take on the Fermi paradox, like the fact that we haven't encountered any other conscious beings outside of Earth so far?
I don't know about that paradox, but you mean like aliens or something?
Yeah, it's basically the paradox of, we know how many stars and habitable planets there are, and it's innumerable. So out of all of these potential other planets that could host life, why haven't we been able to find any signs of them in our telescopes or any of our other devices?
I
Is
don't know. I mean, we're still as powerful and as intelligent as we are as a species. Like, we're still limited in what we're able to perceive.
Yeah.
And
So
all the,
you think they're still out there, we just haven't found them yet?
I don't spend a lot of time thinking about aliens, but I do know there are a lot of people who would say we have already encountered
Right.
the aliens.
Well, that's like the whole Christian modern pseudo-Christian take is that aliens are demons
Right.
and they're
Yeah.
kind of the same thing. And it's also like ghosts that talk to you are demons. So it's almost
There's
like
a lot.
anything that is unnatural or not of this earth is also seen as ungodly and therefore
Yeah.
wrong.
Yeah. It's interesting to me. But it's a very paranoid way of viewing reality.
Yeah. And would you say that religion is a net positive in the world or a net negative or break even?
I mean, I feel frustrated by the way religion has been mobilized by politicians,
Hmm.
especially in America right now. And so I just think it's so specific. I think individual belief in something that transcends the human is positive. Um,
Yeah.
but I think dogmatic institutions that could be encouraging people actually against ethical behavior is negative. But that's like a human problem. Like, that's just another kind of group being created that you're asked to conform to.
Right. It does seem like as people become less religious, they're taking on a new religion by another name, whether that's wokeism or the new religion of anti-racism, or whether it's, on the left or the right of the political divide. And I think that there is, for all of the flaws of something like Catholicism, it is ancient and it stood the test of time. And even if it can mislead some people, it helps so many others. And so I think like almost it's like when in doubt, go with the more ancient belief system that has really stood the test of time.
Yeah, I mean, I think people should keep their minds open though, and like, I've found value in thinking about what, the practices of my ancestors, which is it's just so Catholic on both sides. And but I know, if you have ancestors that you're not proud of, like say they were slave owners in the South or something, or then maybe you don't want to do what your ancestors did, and so you're not
Right.
interested in their religion or their politics. So yeah, it's individual, but I do feel a power in thinking about, like, if I say this prayer in Latin, it's been recited by other people needing help for centuries. And I just find that moving. And it's
Yeah.
almost as much about a connection with the dead and human history as it is about, the efficacy of that prayer or something.
Right. Well, that's the perfect segue to our increasingly digital reality and how much we interface with the ghosts of people, whether they're still living and it's a picture or video that has captured their moment in
Yeah.
time, or whether it's someone who maybe they died long ago. And they're, you bring up our cousin, her Instagram is still active after she had a tragic death, and people will still tag her and comment and like photos. So we're in this really weird time in history where our digital selves outlive our physical selves. And at the same time, when you think about what you're actually spending your day doing, I know for you and me, it's
Hmm.
like 90% of your waking hours are looking at a screen.
Yeah.
And that's not real. It's like it's literally light projections, and that's, that gets to your title, blue light of the screen.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a weird and interesting time to be alive, and it's something about having everything become increasingly virtual, um, and having us get used to that sense, even though there are like physical realities behind like how was your laptop made or where exactly is the cloud storage like storing things. It feels very ethereal.
Hmm.
You're just like pulling these files from somewhere. You're opening up window after window. Especially during like this long quarantine, it's like everyone's face looks kind of the same. Like everyone I'm talking to, either at
Right.
work or socially, is just like another head. Like they might as well be like an actor on TV or something. So there's this sense of like the unreal and not being in a body. Um, and one thing I like speculate about is like as our experience becomes more ghostly, which is to say just images, like
Mm.
disembodied, what does that do to how we think about ghosts or the afterlife? And I, in previous generations, maybe a century ago, um, people reacted to new technologies like the telegraph or the telephone or early photography and film by thinking pretty much immediately about the dead and like, is this a way we can contact the other side? Like even
Mm.
Thomas Edison tried to make some kind of weird phone that could talk to the dead. Um, but with the new technologies that we have today and the kind of rhetoric I hear from like the tech leader billionaires, it seems to be more of a push towards immortality and like extending who we are through AI or through like expensive experimental medical procedures. And I wonder like, is there something about working each day, day after day in these digital images, which can be so easily manipulated and are so ghostly, that's making us, in my opinion, erroneously believe that we can like that we're not bodies anymore, and that
Right.
we're past this whole problem of ghosts and can just like live like we're angels or something that don't, you know.
Yeah, I've noticed that a lot, especially since the pandemic started, where, one person tweeted when all the California fires that are raging and the sky looks, it was this apocalyptic orange color, and the person tweeted, everything looks apocalyptic right now. And then someone replied and they said, no, everything is apocalyptic right now. Why is it that we can't experience our own reality?
Yeah.
It's like we're buffering everything through our phones. And an even more literal example is your iPhone auto corrects the color of the sky to be this
that,
nice
that
blue
was so
because it
frustrating.
couldn't believe that the sky would actually be that color.
Yeah.
And you were in
Oh
San
my
Francisco at the
God.
time, so you
I
experienced
was
that.
really like, I was thinking about the movie The Others a lot that day because I was like, am I dead? Like, is the reason I can't leave my house and I can't see the sun because I'm dead? And it's like the fog in that movie that keeps the family trapped inside. Um, but I mean, what's going on? Like, I wrote those sections in the book in a very different context, and it's wild to me that during this pandemic, like, which is all about a bodily threat,
Hmm.
it's more than ever we have to be aware that we could just get sick and die, and that people we love could get sick and die. And yet for those of us who are fortunate enough to be able to work remotely from our laptops, like life has never been more virtual. And so
Hmm.
you're like living this disembodied daily life, but then like in the background, there's this like fear of like contagion.
Yeah.
So it's a weird paradox.
Yeah. Well, I think we should talk about the future scenarios because, as strange as the times we're living in are right now, it could get a lot stranger from here potentially.
Definitely.
Let's talk about the worst case scenario.
Worst case scenario.
The worst case scenario, which I'm as a pessimist, is kind of also my likely scenario, um, is that people across the world die at an alarming rate, not only from this pandemic, but because of ecological destruction, because of food, you know,
Insecurity.
insecurity, because their homes are being destroyed. Uh, and meanwhile, there's a very small, wealthy elite group that is extending their lives to like, past limits that we have never extended. Sorry, that's really inarticulate. That is extending their lives through these kind of technologies. And so there's just like vast inequality. And so
Yeah.
some people can go on believing that like humanity is progressing because their lives are becoming like more sort of safe. But meanwhile, it's sort of an apocalypse for the rest of the world.
Yeah. Have you seen the show Altered Carbon?
No.
So that it's kind of similar to your worst case where it's basically in the point where you can take your consciousness from one body to another, and rather than being in your head, it's actually in like at the base of your skull, like in your neck almost.
Hmm.
And they call them stacks. And so whenever your body dies, they just pull out the stack and they put it into
Wow.
another body that they call sleeves.
Wow.
And so
Yeah.
you'll have people that have literally lived through like, a dozen sleeves, like a dozen lifetimes of
Yeah.
bodies, and they're super wealthy because you think about how much
Yeah.
wealth you can accumulate in that time. But one thing that I thought was interesting in the show is that every time you transfer your stack to a new sleeve, you lose a little bit of your consciousness. So
Mm,
some of the oldest people, it's almost like they're automatons where they don't have
right.
any like actual spirit in them anymore. They just have the same like mental patterns and memory files and that kind of thing.
It sounds like a vampire story, like a sci-fi version.
Yeah, right.
And there's something horrifying to me about wanting to live for that long.
Hmm.
And I understand it if you think that after this is nothing and life is pretty good for you, so you want to just keep going. But um, it's unnatural to
Right.
to extend your life for centuries. And something about it is just like morally suspect to me.
Yeah, plus
Um,
it's like the quest for immortality prevents you from enjoying your life while you're living it.
right.
It's like, bring up another Alan Watts quote where he says, "You think about things so much that you get into the state where you are eating the menu instead of the dinner, where you value money more than wealth, and are generally confusing the map with the territory."
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, I think that is definitely a bad scenario, and I agree with you that it's not so unlikely. It does kind of seem like a general trajectory we're going in. But
Right.
let's flip it around now and talk about the best case scenario.
Best case scenario.
I think the best case scenario, which seems to be the opposite of what's happening for at least half of the country right now, would be like taking history seriously and taking the dead seriously. And so
Hmm.
in that way, kind of honoring ghosts, and you can take that as a metaphor or as something literal, but to do justice to people who have suffered and died in the past, um, is to consider like how we can like not just keep repeating that in the future. And I think that has like political implications, um, and like social implications for how we should take care of each other. And and I don't think that technology is inherently bad or good. I think it's completely about how we use it. And it's amazing that we have achieved so much and that could be used for great social good. And we have like the resources, or at least some people do, to prevent a lot of death and suffering, but it's just not being equally distributed.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's good to be mindful of death throughout your life so you can really live in the present, and that's what tends to be the best remedy for fear of death is just if you're always living in the present moment, then that moment of terror, the screaming memes never comes
Mm.
because you're always just living moment to moment, and it's almost like just like in any horror movie, the anticipation of something scary is often worse than the actual scary moment where they pop out.
Hmm.
So I think if people can live more presently, that would help. And as far as conquering death, I would hope that if we do conquer death, it's done in a sort of transcendence sort of way, where it's almost like we're going up in the emergence ladder and we're going into like higher dimensions, and it's in that sense it's even more real, like we're experiencing more reality rather than less reality. And we don't do like some sort of cheap hack where yeah, our bodies are still going for a while, but at what cost?
Yeah. I mean, the worst case scenario for ghosts would be, and this is kind of a horror movie answer, would be that we are creating so many ghosts in 2020 that the entire 2020s is like the most haunted and cursed decade we have ever had.
Yeah,
Or
yeah.
it's like the movie Pulse, where like the afterlife becomes too crowded. And so the ghosts start coming into our world and messing things up and horrifying people. So we should watch out for that as well.
Yeah, well, we definitely don't want that. Maybe we bring it home with the most likely scenario now.
Most likely scenario.
I have never felt less confident in my ability to predict the future beyond my own small sphere of influence. Um,
Yeah, someone
I can,
someone mentioned, they said the future has never been more evenly distributed than it is now. Like there's so many
yeah,
ways it could go.
yeah. I mean, I think horror um, will continue to be created. Um, However horrible the real world gets, I think, it's a genre that has been with us from the beginning and will keep growing. Um, I think I think God is is just going to continue to be a tricky concept, and it's hard to disentangle the symbol of God as this sort of politicized thing that is being exploited.
Mm.
Um, but I think people can have their own experiences of spirituality, inside or outside of places of worship.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I just finished reading this amazing book by Carl Sagan, The Demon Haunted World,
Mm,
where he talks about how a lot of the conspiracies and superstitions are really just emblematic of what's going on in people's minds, and we shouldn't be steered off course by that, and we should stick to science. And science, he says, is like a candle in the dark. Like, there's still so much dark we can't see. It's not like we know everything, but
right.
at least it's something, and it's better than being fully in the dark. And so I guess my big hope for the most likely scenario is that science and mysticism find a way to speak a common language,
Hmm.
because it seems like what we've learned from science recently is that there are much more incredible phenomena going on than we would initially have thought. Like when we
Yeah.
think about quantum entanglement and the many worlds theory and what we know to be going on based on scientific experiments, it starts to become much closer to what the mystics have been talking about for thousands of years.
Right.
So if we can somehow match our scientific rigor with the insights that mystics have had, I think we could understand reality to a far greater degree.
Yeah, and I would hope that those that perspective would lead to more humility for people, not so much more achievement or something. Like
Right.
that seems to be one
Not
of
trying
our
to become
primary
God.
problems.
Yeah.
Yeah, not trying to control it all. And I mean, we're never going to have complete knowledge.
Yeah. Well, do you have any final thoughts for listeners about, any for horror fans out there, or any final words?
I would say be sure to remember the dead this season, in October and November especially, and try to stay alive.
All right. I like it. That's a good place to end it. Have a happy Halloween season to everyone listening. This has been Horror, Ghosts, and God. Claire's book, Blue Light of the Screen, comes out October 13th.
What is currently happening,
and we'll see you next
what
time.
will inevitably
Thank
happen.
you.
The past, the present, and the future.
Our computer is picking up a strange signal.
The past, the present, and the future, baby.
What's the world coming to?
The past, the present, and the future. The past, the present, and the future, baby. The past, the present, and the future.
Will attempt to stimulate consciousness.
The past, the present, and the future, baby.
Behind the strange signal is an alien
The
intelligence.
past, the present, and the future. The past, the present, and the future, baby.
It's possible.
If you enjoy thinking about the future as much as we do, we invite you to join the HTF community. Simply go to hencethefuture.com, scroll to the bottom of the homepage, and add your email address next to the button that says Enter the Void. You can also follow us on Instagram and Twitter at hencethefuture. And, most importantly, we encourage you to please rate and review the show in Apple Podcasts if you haven't done so already. Our team reads and appreciates every single review. Thank you again for listening to today's episode and for staying curious, and we'll see you next week.